Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Ariana. It's so nice to see all of you. I am a senior undergraduate research assistant at HEAL, and my project is on the enduring impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on adolescent physical activity, but specifically looking at socio-demographic factors in substance use and how they affected adolescent physical activity. So, some background, physical activity. We know that the World Health Organization recommends at least 60 minutes daily of it, and this is described as elevated heart rate, and no matter what you're doing. So we know that it reduces mental health issues, it reduces obesity and risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And with regard to our project, it was important to know that physical activity is also a very strong determinant for future health and for future participation in physical activity as an adult. We also know that adolescents who engage in less physical activity tend to be of lower socioeconomic status and use substances. So, with regard to the pandemic specifically, this previous study showed us that when comparing blue, pre-pandemic, to orange, in the pandemic, there was a very clear decrease in physical activity among youth, among all of these different variations of physical activity. So what we don't know is what happened afterwards. What happened when these children were able to return to school and have in-person physical activity sessions. So we decided to split up our questions into three. So the first being, what factors, being demographic or substance use, had an association with physical activity during remote schooling? So that looked at the spring of 2021. Then we wanted to know about the change, what happened from during remote schooling to in-person schooling. So did physical activity improve when students returned to in-person schooling? This allowed us to compare spring of 2021 to spring of 2022. Then our third question asked, what factors, again, would it be demographics or substance use, were associated with physical activity, but during in-person school, once they returned? So to do this, we use the advanced study. The advanced study is a self-reported survey that is administered by the HEAL team, and it's administered to about 11 Southern California high schools. And it looks at well-being and behavioral health questions. So we had two samples here, the first being the class of 2024. So the class of 2024, we took data from spring of 2021 when they were ninth graders during remote schooling. We then followed up with them a year after when they were sophomores and were in-person schooling during the spring of 2022. Then we had a second sample, the class of 2025. We only looked at them during their ninth grade year, but when they were in in-person school. So these ninth graders, in comparison to the ninth graders above, started school when they were in person. We had several measures, both at wave 2 and wave 4. The first being, of course, physical activity, which we looked at 60 plus minutes. And it was a self-reported measure, so a quantity of days per week from 0 to 7. We also looked at socio-demographic characteristics. So this was race and ethnicity, gender identity, sexual identity, and the highest parental level of education. Then we looked at substance use. So this was past 30-day use of cannabis, e-cigarettes, and alcohol. And in general, both of our samples had a demographic of majority white or Hispanic, heterosexual, and either identified as male masculine, female feminine, with a few gender minority participants. So, for our statistical analysis, we used a linear regression model to examine all of our outcomes, and these were performed by Melissa Wong. So the first research question, we were looking at the association of socio-demographic characteristics and substance use with physical activity, but during remote school. Then we looked at the change. For the change, we split it into two parts. So for the first part, we simply wanted to look at the change in mean physical activity within sample 1. So when they went from 9th graders during remote school to 10th graders during in-person school. Then we wanted to compare 9th graders to 9th graders. So sample 1 to sample 2 being 9th graders during remote school, and then the 9th graders that started in in-person school. Was there any mean change in physical activity? Then the last association we did was between socio-demographic characteristics and substance use with physical activity during in-person school. So for our first round of results, we see that those who identified in the race ethnicity categories of Hispanic, Asian, or other had a statistically significant lower amount of physical activity during remote school, almost half a day, okay? Then those who identified as female feminine declined to respond to the gender minority question, or were LGBTQA+, also saw similar trends. All of these results showed that they had statistically significant lower physical activity rates during remote school. And now, while our highest level of parental education results were not statistically significant, I still think it's interesting to appreciate that as the level of parental education increases, the students were more likely to engage in physical activity during remote school. So this was really interesting. Those who reported past 30-day alcohol use actually had a positive association with physical activity during remote school. So looking at changes here, when comparing the ninth graders in remote school to 1 year later when they returned to in-person school, you can very clearly see that there was an increase in the amount of physical activity they performed. Again, almost half a day. But then when we compare ninth graders to ninth graders, those who were able to begin in-person schooling had a statistically significant higher increase in physical activity and even greater than when comparing this within the same class. So that was very interesting. So for the last round, we see that now we are in-person school. Okay, so these kids are back, ready to exercise, but those who identify as Asian or other are still seeing a statistically significant lower amount of physical activity. Same with those who identify as female or feminine, and we still see the trend that as parental education increases, physical activity will increase too. We also saw that cannabis use, so past 30-day cannabis use, was associated positively with physical activity this time, rather than alcohol use. So what this all tells us is that overall there was very clearly an increase in physical activity when students returned to in-person school. So this was demonstrated when comparing ninth graders to 1 year later as they returned as 10th graders, but also comparing two separate groups of individuals when they were ninth graders. Then we saw that certain racial ethnic minority groups, those who have lower socioeconomic status or identify as LGBTQA+, had significantly lower physical activity rates during remote school. But then some of these disparities persisted when they returned to in-person school, which tells us that in-person remote schooling isn't the only factor playing in here. And we have to address why certain groups of these students are receiving statistically significant lower amounts of physical activity and what these schools can do about it. Then, very, very interestingly, contradicting literature, we saw that substance use was actually positively associated with physical activity, and that was both during remote school and in-person school. So we think that this could potentially be due to the types of social groups that these individuals have right there in high school. They could potentially be athletes, exposing them to different social scenes and people that might have earlier access to these substances. Granted, a limitation of the study is that our survey asks if they do physical activity or not. We do not know what kind of physical activity they're engaging in. So this could tell us a lot more information about why substance use was positively associated and why certain groups of individuals weren't able to participate in physical activity compared to non-minority counterparts. So next steps, the advanced study produces a report every year that we send out to all of the high schools. So I'm going to create a page dedicated to physical activity to hopefully highlight why it's so important and which groups at each individual school are really suffering and what they can do about it and hopefully mitigate it in the future. Thank you.
Any questions? Thank you, Ariana.
Thank you.